freedom, independence from being constrained by another's choice, insofar as it can coexist with the freedom of every other in accordance with a universal law, is the only original right belonging to every man by virtue of his humanity. Immanuel Kant. To Kant, as I explained in my previous lecture, moral philosophy, or metaphysics of morals, can be divided into two sciences: ethics and right, or law, or justice. I talked in that previous lecture about the issue of translation. Now, moral philosophy in general is the doctrine of duties. And so both of those, ethics and also the right, are concerned with duties, with what we ought to do. But they are concerned with them in a different manner. Right is only concerned with those duties, Kant says, that come with a right for other people to compel us to fulfill them. Right? So I have a moral obligation not to murder others, not to steal from others. But on top of that, those other people have the right to force me to fulfill these moral duties. They have the right to use force, to use violence, even if they must, in order to prevent me from murdering them or from stealing from them. And so right is not concerned with all our duties, but just with a specific set of duties. And it is also concerned with them in a different manner. I gave a lecture on the faculty of desiring, and I explained there that to Kant it has two parts. It has the will and it has the faculty of choice. And choice, he calls the faculty which, chooses specific actions. It chooses, should I do A or should I do B? While the will is a completely supersensual faculty, which is not concerned with specific choices, specific actions, but rather the will decides what general mode of action I want to take. For example, the will, if it's a good will, decides I want to always do good, whatever that may be in any given situation. Now, in the given situation, again, the faculty of choice has to choose a specific action, and based on the good will, it will now choose the most moral action. But the will doesn't directly choose the action. The will just decides in general, I want to be good. Now, with this in mind, I said that ethics is concerned with the will. Ethics cares about what is inside of us, not simply about the specific actions that spring from the will, but rather about us doing good deeds out of a good will. While right, I said, is concerned with the faculty of choice alone. So right demands that we choose to do specific actions and that we choose to not do other actions, but it doesn't care why we choose them. It doesn't care if you choose to not murder somebody because you are a good person and you have reverence for that other person's humanity, or if you choose to not murder somebody simply because you are afraid of jail, while maybe on your inside you would very much like to see this person dead. That may make you a bad person as judged by ethics, but in the field of right, it doesn't matter why you do or not do something. It only matters that you choose to do or not do something. Now, the right in general, Kant again divides into two fields. There is what he calls private right or private law, private justice, and public right or public law, public justice. The former being right considered simply from the standpoint of reason. So what rights do we have according to reason? What law should there be? Even in the state of nature, that is, even if there was no state, no government, no positive laws. But of course, in this state, us acting according to what is right would depend on either us being virtuous people, so we would do it out of ethical reasons, or other individuals maybe forcing us, maybe compelling us. And this would not work, which is precisely why we need public right, that is, we need a right that is publicly declared. We need a social contract between the people that erects a state, and we need the state to enforce the rights. And then we also need something above the level of the state. We need some sort of international system. All of that belongs to the public right and is something I want to deal with in future lectures. Here, I want to first get into private right. And this private right only really deals with one thing, according to Kant, and that is freedom. It is all about several free beings living alongside each other, and the right should prevent us from taking each other's freedom away. So I already said right is about the faculty of choice, about what actions we choose. And that means to Kant that it is against the right, that is, it is unjust. I mentioned in the previous lecture when I talked about the translation how in German the word for justice is Gerechtigkeit, while the word for right is Recht. So what is against the right is Unrecht, unjust. It's directly related, a relation that unfortunately is lost in the English. So it is unjust to, with my faculty of choice, choose any action that interferes with other people's choice. While any action that doesn't interfere with their choice, even while it might still be against ethics, for example, against the duties towards myself, is not an unjust action. Right is therefore completely formal. It doesn't care about, it's not material, it doesn't care about the content of our actions. It only cares about their form, them having such a form that they don't interfere with the freedom of others. Right? In ethics, it's also about the material of your actions. It's about actively helping others. I talked about that in the lecture on the morality of love and the morality of reverence. To Kant, there are wider duties that are about furthering the purposes of others, right? Helping others in their aims. But that doesn't concern the right. The right is only concerned with me respecting, revering the rights of others, and that means, once again, using my choice in such a manner that it doesn't interfere with the free choice of others. And if you ask what is the object of right, then since right is about the faculty of choice, and therefore about the actions we choose to do in the world, in the sensual world, Kant says right is concerned with all objects that are at least potentially objects of our free choice. That is, objects onto which or with which I can act, which is on the one hand all the non-rational items in the world, right? Any non-rational thing I can potentially use. Most things in the world, of course, are not used by us, like even many things here on this planet, but then pretty much anything on other planets in the universe is not used by us. But potentially it could be. Potentially we could fly to some other planet and claim a rock that is there and say this rock is now mine, and then potentially someone else could say no, I want it to be mine, and there could be a conflict. So while now right doesn't have to deal with property rights on other planets, if technology evolved to a point where we would go to other planets, then right would have to deal with that. And on the other hand, not just non-rational items are an object of right, but of course also rational beings who are not only rational beings, but who also have bodies, who also appear in the sensual world. Because such beings, human beings, are also potential objects of my choice, right? I could attack any human being, kill him, or abduct him, or whatever. And of course, that I shouldn't do. That is something the right forbids me to do. While a pure rational being, that is God, is not an object of right. Because he is not an object, not even a potential object of my choice. I cannot do anything with God or against God. I cannot act upon God because he is not sensual. Like, whether you believe in a God or not, you would have to agree that we cannot harm God, we cannot harm God's rights, and therefore he is not an object of right. Now, before I get further into this, I just want to point out one thing, and that is that between Kant's philosophy of right and his theoretical philosophy, his epistemology, there is a great parallelism in the structure, in some of the arguments used. And so it is immensely helpful to first deal with his theoretical philosophy, to first understand his theoretical philosophy. That will also help you better understanding his philosophy of right. And of course, I have already dealt with his theoretical philosophy in previous lectures, so if there is something in this lecture or in upcoming lectures that you don't quite understand, I would suggest first checking out those previous lectures on theoretical topics, because that will probably shine a lot of light on Kant's philosophy of right. But with that out of the way, let's get further into the private right. Now, Kant distinguishes here two sorts of rights. On the one hand, we have what he calls inner or innate rights, and on the other hand, we have what he calls outer or acquired rights. Let's start with the former. The innate rights or inborn rights, well, they are what the name suggests, right? They are rights that we are born with. So, in other words, they are rights that we have simply by virtue of being human beings. And that's of course not the case for all our rights, right? Like if you own a bike, you have a right to that bike. It is yours, you can choose what to do with it, and no one else has a right to take that bike, to use that bike, unless you give permission for it. But clearly, you don't have a right to that bike simply because you are a human being. Clearly, you were not born with a right to a bike in general, and certainly not with a right to this specific bike in particular. Rather, this right to this bike is something you acquired at some point in your life. How exactly? That's an important question for the philosopher of right. But for now, let's stick with the innate rights. Those, once again, you didn't acquire, you simply have. And this means that these innate rights, they are basically what we would call human rights nowadays. Because, again, you have them simply by being human. The term as such does not appear yet in Kant. But basically that is what it is, right? They are rights you have as a human being. Now, the main accomplishment here of Kant when it comes to this is simply narrowing these rights down to one right. Kant would say we basically have only one innate right, or in today's terminology, only one human right, and that is once again the right of freedom. And this is what reason desires, right? I gave a lecture much earlier on what is reason, and Kant says reason is the faculty of principles. So reason wants to find, when there is a manifoldness, the principle behind it, from which this manifoldness can be deduced. And when it comes to rights, well, of course, you can talk about manifold rights: the right to live, the right to not be physically harmed, the right to free speech, the right to property. But then nothing would prevent you, except from it being useless, nothing would prevent you from specifying these rights even further. I mean, we don't have to say that we have a right to live, a right to not be killed. We could also say more specifically, we have a right to not be shot, and we have a separate right to not be beheaded, and we have a separate right to not be burned, and so on and so on. Or likewise, instead of in general saying we have a right to not be physically harmed, we could say we have a right to not be hit, and we have a right to not be kicked, and so on, right? And instead of saying we have a right to free speech, you could say you have a specific right to say A, and you have another right to say B, and another right to say C, and so on. And just like you could differentiate the rights more in that one direction, you could also go in the other direction and could combine them even more, right? Just like you could combine the various rights to not be shot, not be burned, not be beheaded into the one right to not be killed, you could also combine this right to not be killed, the right to not be physically harmed, the right to free speech, the right to property, and so on, into the one right to freedom. Because if you think about it, all attacks of your rights are ultimately in some way attacks on your freedom. either taking your freedom completely, like when you are killed, or taking part of your freedom, like when your bike is stolen, then you don't have the freedom anymore to drive around on your bike. And so Kant would say the one truly innate right a human being has is the right to freedom, and that is literally innate, right? We are born with this faculty of choice, and no one is allowed to interfere with it, to take it away from us. Since this right to freedom and everything that can be directly deduced from it is an innate right, Kant would stress that when there is a state that gives positive laws about respecting those rights, like the state makes laws that nobody shall be killed, nobody shall be stolen from, and so on, the state doesn't really give those rights because people already have them independently and before there is a state. All the state does is acknowledge these rights that we already have, and when he gives such a law, the state basically just announces that it is going to respect and to enforce those rights that, however, exist already independently of the state. And these innate rights, or really the one innate right of freedom, is of course concerned with rational beings, that is, with other human beings, right? They are, as I already said, potential objects of our choice. We can inflict our actions on them, but we have no right to do so against their will. And so here the state, if it does put these rights into laws, really just enforces a part of ethics, right? Really just forces people to act in a manner that they would act if they were virtuous people. However, as I already said, not just other rational beings, but non-rational items, be they inanimate objects, but be they also plants or animals, are the objects, at least the potential objects, of our choice. And we don't have an innate positive right towards those things, right? As I already said, we are not born with a right to, let's say, own this bike or to own this tree there. However, Kant says we do have an innate negative right of those things. Negative right here meaning we have a right to not be prevented from making them objects of our choice, right? That negative right too can be deduced from our innate right to freedom. If I have a right to be free, if I have a right to make use of my faculty of choice however I like, to choose any sort of action I like, provided it's not an action interfering with someone else's choice, then that means I can also choose, let's say if there's a tree that doesn't belong to anyone, I can also choose to pluck the fruits from that tree, or to cut down that tree and burn it for firewood or whatever. Or if there's a well that doesn't belong to anyone, some source in nature, some water source, then I can use my faculty of choice to, let's say, drink from it. And this is, once again, a negative right. I don't have a positive right, like I can't say, okay, this tree is mine. I have a right to eat from it, to take the fruits and eat them, and nobody else has that right. But I have the negative right that I can say, well, this tree is not mine, but it is also not anybody else's, so nobody has the right to prevent me from taking the fruits. So this is the first thing, this negative right. But of course, we can acquire positive rights to certain objects. They are not innate rights, we are not born with them, but we can acquire them, which is precisely why Kant calls them acquired or also outer rights. The question how this works is one of the main questions for the philosophy of right. How do you acquire a right? How does something that was not your right when you were born at some point become your right? In other words, how can you acquire property? How can something become yours? How can something that doesn't belong to anyone, that is out there in the world, and everyone has a negative right to it, that is, no one has a right to say, no, you mustn't touch this isn't yours. How does this become mine? How do I get this positive right to indeed say to others, no, you mustn't touch this isn't yours? It's a question that most people won't ask, because it's just a reality of our daily lives, right? That we do have such acquired rights, that every one of us has property, and we also exchange things all the time. Like we buy new things, maybe we also sell things. And of course, here it's not complicated. Like when you buy something, it's clear how this can become your right, because someone else who had a right to this thing gives it to you. But how did he get a right to this thing? Well, he probably also bought it from a third person. But how did this start? Again, a question that most people won't ask, that maybe they will even find useless, because they will say, well, clearly it did start somehow, clearly it does work, we do have rights to things, so that's good enough for me. But then, I mean, you can say that, but then you refuse to engage in philosophy, right? Philosophy, as Plato already said, philosophy starts with wondering. So with not taking things for granted, but rather with questioning things. And this questioning in this particular case might be important for finding out what is just, right? For finding out what should belong to whom. Or indeed, if things should even belong to someone. Of course, there's also this phrase, property is theft, right? There are, of course, certain people, certain leftist theories that believe that we don't ever acquire positive rights to things, or at least we shouldn't. So what does Kant say here? Well, he says, first off, you can acquire a right to an object simply by taking hold of that object. That is what he calls the possession, which is a word that you can take literally here, right? Because it comes from the Latin, of course, and it means something like the possibility to sit, right? Sidere means sitting, and so your possession, so to say, is that which you sit on, like a piece of land, a house where you can sit and nobody else can sit. So And Kant says if we take hold of an object, if we now literally possess that object, we now have an exclusive right to that object for as long as we take hold of it, right? So again, take a tree that doesn't belong to anyone, that is out there in nature. Let's say there are apples growing on that tree. Now, first, every human being has a negative right to every single of these apples. Meaning, if I'm about to pluck one specific apple, no one else has a right to tell me, no, this apple isn't yours, you mustn't take it. But then, if another person was faster than me and plucked that apple first, I also wouldn't have the right to tell him, no, that apple is mine, you cannot take it. But now, Kant says, the moment you take the apple into your hand, the moment you're holding on to that apple, now indeed only you have a right to that apple, and no other human being has the right. They did have the negative right to take it from the tree, but they don't have the right to take it out of your hand. And why is that? Well, once again, because of your innate rights, because of your human rights, so to speak, to freedom, right? Because if I were to take the apple out of your hand by force, I would once again interfere with your freedom. Likewise, when you consider the right to the ground, first off, no piece of ground belongs to anyone. So we all have a negative right to stand wherever we want. If someone sits down on a specific front, let's say on an empty beach that doesn't belong to anyone, then you cannot tell him, this specific spot belongs to me, you mustn't sit there. No, you weren't there, so it doesn't belong to you. But now when the person does stand or sit on that spot, then now he does have an exclusive right to that spot. Meaning no one has a right to drive him away from that spot by force, like to threaten him with a weapon or maybe to just push him away, because again, that would interfere with that person's innate right to freedom. So you can see how our innate right, our right to be free, our right to our own free choice, can lead us to acquire a right to any object which we currently possess. But of course, the key here is currently, right? This right is a right, this exclusive right to that object is a right that is only temporary, and that you lose as soon as your literal possession of that object ends. So if you pluck that apple, while you hold it in your hand, you now have a right to that apple. But if you decide to not eat it, but to put it on the ground again, and you walk away, and somebody else takes up that apple, then you cannot come back and say, oh, that was my apple. Or likewise, if you inhabit a specific spot on the ground, you mustn't be pushed away. But if you step away out of your own choice, and now somebody else steps onto that ground, then now you mustn't push him away. You cannot push him away saying, oh, this was my spot, I was here first. You let go of that spot. And if you think about it, this is indeed how in many daily situations, without thinking about it, we indeed deal with these things, right? Like if, let's say, take a beach at the sea or at some lake, if a person lays down there on his towel in the sun, then he does consider himself to now have a right to that spot. I mean, you can try to just push that person off his towel and take the towel and throw it from the spot, and now taking possession of that spot yourself. The person will probably be angry. But when the person goes home after a few hours and then maybe comes back the next day or a week later or a year later and finds someone else being on that same spot, the person would usually not be angry. And if he does get angry and says, "This is my spot," then we would say that person is being stupid. This is nobody's spot. The beach doesn't belong to anyone. Likewise, if you take up a stone at the beach into your hand, you probably wouldn't like somebody else just grabbing it out of your hand without asking. But if you decided to throw the stone, to let it skip over the water, and now it would sink into the lake, and let's say a week later somebody else dives into the lake and finds the stone on the ground and picks it up and takes it with him, we wouldn't consider this an issue. We wouldn't consider this stealing. So clearly, the way Kant describes us acquiring a right temporarily to that object which we right now possess, a right which only lasts while we possess that object, clearly that is indeed how we usually see things. But of course, that can't be everything. Just acquiring a right to a thing while we literally possess that thing. Because clearly, if that was the case, we could not hold onto property. It would mean that maybe the clothes I'm currently wearing are my property, but as soon as I undress and strip out of them and put them away, everyone else would have the right to take them with him. It would mean that maybe the house someone lives in is his property while he's living in it, but as soon as he goes out one time, anyone else would have the right, because the house is now empty, to inhabit it and take it for himself. And this clearly can't be. This clearly wouldn't work. Kant would say it would destroy all our effectiveness in the world. We could not really make plans anymore, right? I mean, let's say you go somewhere with your bike or with your car, somewhere that is maybe a little bit further away, so you wouldn't like to walk all the way. And now, of course, while you are on your bike, no one has the right to push you off and take the bike. Or while you are in the car, no one has the right to force you out of the car and take it. But let's say you arrive and you let your bike or your car stand somewhere and you do some stuff for some hours. And let's say while you were away, anyone could just take your bike or your car and drive away with it. Well, now how do you go back home, right? And if you had known before that this would likely happen, that anyone could take your vehicle, then maybe you wouldn't have come here in the first place, because you wouldn't want to have to walk all the way home, right? So our plans would seriously be hindered if we had acquired rights only to objects that we currently hold on to. Indeed, even our innate rights would be threatened by this, like our right to live. Of course, it's not entirely impossible to live without property, but it could only be the most primitive life, right? We could never store things. Like we could hunt for food, we could search for roots and berries in the woods, and but we would have to eat them directly from our hand, because as soon as we put them out of our hand, again, to maybe store them somewhere for the upcoming days or weeks, everyone else could now take this food away from us, right? And of course, stuff like farming would basically be impossible, because the farmer would have a right to the land that he farms only while he is himself on the land, while he is farming it. So while he is plowing the ground, or while he is putting in the seeds into the earth. But then, of course, as soon as he went away, once again, making plans, planning for the seeds to grow so that eventually he could harvest those crops. As soon as he went away, someone else could stamp onto the ground and do something else with it, like build a house on top there, which would, of course, completely destroy the harvest. And if the farmer complained, the other person could say, why? I haven't pushed you off this land. You left it yourself. I waited, I let you do there whatever you wanted while you were on it. But now you're gone. Now I'm on the land, so now you need to let me do whatever I want. But of course, that same person building his house, as soon as he left his house, the farmer could come back and tear the house down. So it's clear that a word like this wouldn't work. And that's an important point to cut, that it wouldn't work. Because here I remind you of the categorical imperative of the moral law in its most famous phrasing. I talked about this in its own lecture on the categorical imperative, the moral law. It says that you should only act according to a maxim through which you can want for it to become a universal law. And as I explained, what this means is the maxim of your action, that is the subjective principle according to which you act, should be one that could be a universal law, an objective principle according to which everyone has to act. Only if that would work can your action be moral. If such a world, however, wouldn't work, if your action only works as an exception to a general law, and you yourself cannot want for it to be more than an exception, you yourself cannot want for it to be universal, then it is immoral. This is, for example, why lying is immoral, right? Lying only works as an exception because you can only lie to someone who believes that you are saying the truth. If lying was a universal law, that is, if everyone always lied whenever it benefited them, then no one would believe you. And then you could not lie to anyone in the strictest sense. You could, of course, say something that is untrue, but you could not lie. That is, you could not trick someone into believing this untruth, because the other person would already assume to be lied to and would not believe anything. So therefore, lying is immoral. And this is important because this principle, your actions mustn't contradict themselves. Your actions must be such that their principle could be universalized. This moral law applies here too. Kant says reason demands that any object that is potentially usable by rational beings, so any object that is a potential object of our choice, must also be indeed available to use. Now, if we could constantly take objects that others want to use, that others make plans with, as soon as those others don't directly possess those objects, then if you take this maxim and universalize it, make it a universal law, that would mean that usable objects become essentially unusable. And that would be a self-contradiction. Reason demands that humans don't just survive, but that they improve their life. The reason demands that we cultivate and that we perfect ourselves, and therefore also the world around us, Kant would say, right? So if there's a river and we need to somehow get on the other side, reason demands that a bridge be built. Reason doesn't want humans to constantly have to walk many, many miles till there's a crossing or to swim across, but for the world to be cultivated, to become more reasonable, that is more fit for being inhabited by rational beings. And that cannot be if there is no property, if what one human being plans and starts to do with certain objects can be always undone by the next human being. All of morality, to Kant, is about freedom. I already explained that in my previous lectures on the moral duties, the duties towards myself and towards others, and then the narrow and wider, the perfect and imperfect duties, that all of morality is about freedom. It is about first making sure we stay free, so not taking my or not taking others' freedom away. But then secondly, the wider duties are about even expanding freedom. Now, if it was universal law, however, that as soon as someone let go of an object that he had taken possession of, we could take possession of that object, and even if it interferes with his plans that he had with that object, then that would not expand, it would actually hinder human freedom. It would actually prevent rationality from fully realizing itself in this world. And therefore it would be immoral. Because, again, morality is there to protect and to expand freedom. And anything is immoral that is against freedom. Once again, Kant would say all potentially usable objects in the world, reason demands that they indeed be usable and not be made unusable. As a side note, here I'm using this as the argument for why property should exist, of course. This is the reason Kant gives why it is a moral imperative that there should be property. But the same principle is also why things shouldn't unnecessarily be harmed or destroyed. I will go back to this when at a later point I will talk about what Kant says about animals, about such a thing as animal rights. And I can already say, Kant says animals as such don't have rights, but still we should not abuse them. And this also comes from this principle. that Kant says nothing that potentially could be used should be made unusable for no reason. So, and this goes not only for animals, but even for inanimate objects. Kant would say it is immoral to mindlessly, out of sheer joy of destroying, destroy things. Like if you cross a desert and you come to an oasis and you rest there, you drink some of the water, you eat some of the fruits, and now you go on. Okay, maybe you don't need that oasis anymore. Maybe you have no intention to ever cross that desert again, so you don't need it anymore. But if now you poison the water and cut down all the trees before you go on, you're an immoral person. Because while you have no use for this, maybe somebody else might have come across the desert and would have had a use for this oasis. And whatever could potentially be used for rational purposes should not be made unusable. And this, to come back to the topic I'm discussing here, this is the reason Kant gives why property must exist. Because only if there is property, only if we can make long-term plans and if we can rely on things not being interfered with just because we put them away for a moment, only then can rationality fully realize itself in the world. And here I want to digress a bit and to use this to make an important remark. And that is that Kant's morality and the categorical imperative has very often been criticized as being an example of empty formalism. And this is a criticism that you hear till this day, but that is very old, almost that started almost immediately. And one of the oldest and also most famous proponents of this sort of criticism is Hegel. And many who nowadays criticize Kant for what they think is his empty formalism will do so pointing to what Hegel said in his Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel is saying that the categorical imperative, because it is a merely formal principle, can be used to justify or to forbid anything. So the very same action can be considered moral and immoral based on how you use the categorical imperative. And Hegel indeed does use the example of theft. So Kant would say stealing is immoral according to the categorical imperative because it cannot become a universal law, because as a universal law it would destroy property as such, right? So the thief wants to steal as an exception, but as a general rule he wants there to be property that is not stolen. He doesn't want it to be he doesn't want everything to be free so anyone can grab it, right? So when you are stealing someone else's car, in general you want cars to not be stolen, because maybe you now want to keep the car for yourself, you want to drive around with it, and you don't want to have it stolen as soon as it's in your garage. And if stealing became a universal law, then you probably wouldn't bother even stealing in the first place, because by stealing you take what somebody else owns and you now want to make it your possession. But if everyone else was also constantly stealing, then it wouldn't be your possession, because the next person could now steal it from you. And it would not be worth even going through the hassle of stealing something, if it would just be immediately taken from you again as well. So stealing as a universal law would mean there is no property, and if there's no property, then you cannot steal. Therefore, this self-contradicts, therefore this is immoral. What Hegel says here is that this argument is correct, there is a self-contradiction here, but only if we start from the premise that there should be property in the first place. Hegel says we could also start from the opposite premise, that property shouldn't exist. And if you start from that premise, then now this means if you do make something your property, let's say if you take a tree not as common property where everyone can pluck the fruits, but now you put a fence around that tree and tell other people, this is my tree now, you mustn't pluck the fruits from there. Now this action, taken as a universal law and not just as an exception, would create a self-contradiction, right? Because if you say there should be no property, but now you make one object yours and tell others you can't take this object. Now, if everyone started doing that, then there would be property. Everyone would have property. And if your premise is that any object should be free to be grabbed and used by anyone, then you would now be in contradiction of that premise. And so it would follow from the categorical imperative, if we start from the premise everything should be free to use by everyone, that property is theft. That by making something exclusively yours and excluding others from it, you are basically stealing it from them. And this argument of Hegel's, I think, doesn't show that Kant has an empty formalism in his moral philosophy, but rather Hegel has this empty formalism, or Hegel misunderstands Kant as being just formalistic, because this argument of Hegel's completely ignores what Kant says in his philosophy of right about property and about why there should be property and there needs to be property. Sure, completely considering it completely abstractly, I could imagine a world where there is property and I'm not allowed to take things that belong to others, or I could imagine a world where everything is free to be used by everyone and therefore I'm not allowed to take it for myself. But if I'm not thinking so abstractly, but rather asking myself, okay, would such a world work? I can see that the second world would not work. That, as Kant says, if everyone can just take anything at any time, as soon as somebody else lets go of it, our effectiveness in the world would be destroyed. Our plans would be destroyed, and potentially usable objects would become unusable, which is against reason. So there must be property. And so it is not true that the merely formal character of the moral law means that it goes with any possible content, even with contradicting contents, but rather, if you think it through, that specific form does lead to a very specific content. And I'm mentioning this, of course, on the one hand, because it is a common objection to Kant's moral philosophy, and I wanted to take this opportunity to deal with this objection and to point out how Kant himself refutes it. But I'm also mentioning it because it gives me an opportunity to make an even more general remark. Because I want to say that, of course, no philosopher's writings, no philosopher's system is quite perfect and without error. Kant himself says as much. He says that in any philosophy there's still some things that are worthy of criticism and improvement. So, of course, you can criticize even a great thinker like Kant. Of course, this should be done. And I myself do that. I don't blindly follow Kant in everything. I have already criticized Kant in previous lectures, and I will criticize him more in upcoming lectures. Of course, the criticism itself can also sometimes be wrong, can also contain errors, which is the case here. But that in itself is not a problem. You can go wrong, it happens. What is a problem is when not the philosopher as such is criticized, but a specific image of the philosopher is criticized. Not what he really says, but what people think he says. Not what really follows from what he says, but what people think follows from what he says. And this can happen because of misunderstandings, because you read something a philosopher says and you simply interpret it in a wrong way. And then you are answering to your misinterpretation and not to the actual philosopher. This can happen, of course. So even that shouldn't happen to someone like Hegel, who himself wants to be a philosopher. But then it can also happen that you answer not to the actual philosopher, but just to an image you have of that philosopher, not because you misunderstood something he wrote, but because you simply didn't read it at all. You simply don't know what that philosopher says. You don't misunderstand it, you just don't know at all. You just make it up in your own head. And that is something that should not be done at all, but it is done again and again, starting with Hegel. But till this day, I hear this criticism that with the categorical imperative, you could prove both that there should be and that there shouldn't be property, when Kant very explicitly writes about how from the categorical imperative it follows that there should be property and not the opposite. And I wonder, have these people not read the passages where Kant talks about this? And if they haven't done so, then why do they talk about Kant? Why do they judge Kant? Why don't they first read more of Kant? And this is something that unfortunately happens a lot. I mean, if it happens even to a great thinker like Hegel, then you can imagine how often it happens to people who are not thinkers at all, not even bad thinkers. I mean, just look around at the state of public discourse, right? Like, we have seen in the past 2 years, lots of people denying the genocide in Gaza and coming up with excuses for Israel and accusing anyone who is against genocide of being anti-Semitic. And there you have it, that these people usually simply don't know what they are talking about. Like, they never bothered to actually look. They don't know that in Israeli TV people talk openly about how children are the enemies and how even little children and babies must be killed because they will just grow up to be terrorists. And they don't know that Israelis have protested for the right to rape, prisoners, that someone accused of having raped a prisoner could go on national TV and talk about how that was totally justified. They simply don't know these things. And yet they make their judgments. Or consider how certain people are judged, and not just philosophers. Like, consider someone like Greta Thunberg. I have heard so often concerning her famous speech in front of the UN, where she said her "How dare you?" and where she said, "You have stolen my childhood, you have stolen my dreams." So often I have heard mockery of that speech coming from completely random people and going all the way up to Putin, where people say, and not just internet trolls. I've read this even recently from people who pretend to be serious journalists here in Germany, but really are just propagandists. People mocking that speech, saying, "Oh, she's so privileged. She's a white Swedish girl. She should tell this to some child soldier or some child having to work in the mines in Africa, that her childhood was stolen." And the thing about this is that if these people had actually listened to her speech in good faith, like if they hadn't just heard accounts of it, if they hadn't just heard, "Oh, in her speech she said, 'How dare you?' She said, 'You have stolen my childhood,'" but rather if they had bothered to spend the 5 minutes to actually listen to the speech in whole, then they would know that in the very next sentence, after saying, "You have stolen my childhood, you have stolen my dreams," she says, "And yet I'm one of the lucky ones." I mean, if there's one person who has constantly been acknowledging her privilege, who has constantly been talking about climate justice for a reason, not just about protecting the climate in general, but about doing it in a just way, who has talked about how the rich countries need to lower their emissions even more than would be necessarily just to protect the climate, so that poorer countries can emit a bit more and get to a higher standard of living. If there's one person who has constantly talked about that, it is Greta Thunberg. So such mockery can only be done either in bad faith, which surely is the case often, or out of complete ignorance, not actually having listened to the speech. And this, apart from being simply pathetic and embarrassing, this simply isn't how a discourse should go. This simply isn't how we can, no matter what is the topic, how we can get closer to the truth. We should know what we are talking about. We should, when judging something, we should actually first deal with it, first listen to it, first understand it. Which is precisely the reason why, before starting this lecture series, I read all of Kant, all 29 volumes of his works, because I didn't want to talk about something that I only understand half of. I didn't want to criticize something when maybe in some other work of his that I haven't read, he addresses that criticism. And maybe if I had just read that work, then I would not have mentioned that sort of criticism. And I want to keep doing that if I can. When I'm one day done with these Kant lectures, I want to go on talking about other philosophers equally extensively. And there too, I want to first fully read them before I go on to talk about them and to explain them to others. But going back now to Kant's argument for why there should be property. This is one of these instances I mentioned where you have a parallelism with his theoretical philosophy. Because, and Kant himself points this out, it's not just something that I realized, the argument is kind of similar to the argument he uses against empirical idealism. And I discussed this in previous lectures, in my lecture mainly on rational psychology, that by empirical idealism, Kant means what today often gets called solipsism. So the position that only I exist and everything empirical, so everything I know from experience, that is the whole outer world, including other human beings, including my own body, is only ideal, that is only exists in my thoughts, in my consciousness, but doesn't truly exist. It's all a dream or something. This position Kant refutes by showing that even the I, your own self, is something you can only be aware of if you are aware of other things, of a non-I, of something that is not yourself. Mere representations, that is your thoughts, your feelings, and so on, your desires, they are fleeting. There is nothing solid, nothing steady there. And so if they were all you had, then your own I would become fleeting too. If the I is to be something steady, then it can only be, and it can only be discovered if held against other steady things, against objects that are not the I. So even my self-consciousness requires consciousness of other things that are not myself and that are still real. Well, in the same way, here in the philosophy of right, Kant says, even my own innate rights require the outer, the acquired rights. If I cannot acquire rights to other objects, if I cannot make other objects mine, my property, then even what is my property by birth, that is me with my body, with my freedom, cannot be mine properly. Then even my own innate rights are threatened, because once again I cannot plan, I cannot store food, I cannot farm the ground to have food in the winter or whatever. So even my own basic human rights would then be threatened. So to put it simply, with Fichte we could say there cannot be an I without a you. Or as Fichte would say, the I requires a non-I. Which is why Fichte's philosophy has sometimes been called an I philosophy, but I think it would be much more correct to call it a we philosophy. And the same, Kant would say, once again, is true for the rights. My own innate rights cannot be realized, cannot really work without rights that are acquired, without outer rights. So that is why there must be property. Of course, the question is still, how does this work? And here we have a dialectics of the philosophy of right, Kant says. Now, what dialectics means, I already addressed in its own lecture. And at least in Kant's terminology, it is the teaching or the doctrine of illusion. That is, dialectic occurs to him when our reason, by its very nature, so not because we are too dumb to think right or because someone tricks us, but by its very nature creates an illusion. That is, creates an argument that sounds right for reason, but that is actually wrong in some way. And there is a dialectic for Kant in all parts of his philosophy, in his theoretical philosophy, in aesthetics, in his moral philosophy, in his philosophy of religion, and also in his philosophy of right. And it is always an important part, a key part of Kant's whole critical philosophical project, to show, to explain, and ultimately to solve this dialectic where reason tangles up itself. And usually, including here, the dialectic takes the form of an antinomy. So much so that the two terms are almost synonymous when it comes to Kant. It is only in theoretical philosophy, it is only in his critique of pure reason, where there are also other forms of the dialectic. And what the antinomy is, I also already explained in my lecture on rational cosmology. An antinomy for Kant means that we have two statements that seemingly contradict each other, so only one of them can be true. And yet, it seems that reason proves both of them, or disproves both of them. And the dialectic in the philosophy of right is such that the thesis says we can own something without a direct physical connection with that object, while the antithesis says the opposite, says no, if there's no physical possession, like if I'm not holding the thing in my hand or standing on that specific ground, then I cannot own that object. Both statements seem to contradict each other. I will point out that, as is the case in other parts of his system, like in the theoretical philosophy, where there's also an antinomy, the thesis is a rationalist one, saying that we can own something even if we don't see the possession in experience. It's not something we can experience, right? If you are away from your house, then people cannot experience you being the owner. But still, you can be the owner. We can think of you as the owner. While the antithesis is an empiricist position, right? Saying that you can own something only if there's a direct possible experience of you owning it. That is, if you're holding it in your hand, for example. Now, Kant solves this as he usually solves these antinomies, through his theory of transcendental idealism. But that is, I also explained in a previous lecture already on transcendental idealism. Simply put, it is the distinction that Kant makes between things as they appear and things in themselves. So he would say that the whole world, that nature, is an appearance. the things, the phenomena as he calls them, are the things quite literally as they appear to us, but not as they are in themselves, independently of appearing to us. Those would be the noumena, the things of thought, because nous in Greek is basically the intellect, while phenomenon is just a Greek word for appearance. Well, Kant uses this distinction here in his philosophy of right as well. It's a very important distinction that always reappears in Kant's philosophy, and it's one of the basic things you need to understand if you want to understand anything about Kant. So I really recommend that earlier lecture on transcendental idealism. Kant says that there is something like physical property, something that you own in experience in the sensual world. He calls that possessio phenomenon. And then there is, on the other hand, intellectual property, which he calls the possessio noumenon. And here by intellectual property, he doesn't understand what maybe we would think of nowadays when we hear that word. The property to some idea, the property maybe to a name or an image, a story, whatever. No. You can have intellectual property with something that is a quite physical object, like let's take a house. What Kant means by intellectual property is simply a virtual relationship you have with that object that you own. A relationship that is not experienced, is not seen, but that exists in reason. So a relationship that we can think. Right? So if you are in your house right now, then it's currently in your physical possession. So it is your possessio phenomenon. But if you leave your house, it now for a time leaves your physical possession, but it can still stay your intellectual property. That is, while you are not physically connected with it right now. And that means if someone else were to break into the house and inhabit it while you are gone, he would not do direct physical damage to your freedom, as opposed to kicking you out while you are in the house. Still, while you are gone, there is still a virtual connection between you and the house, a connection that cannot be experienced, but a connection that you can think and everyone else can think. And because we can all think that connection, this house, while currently empty, while the owner is currently away, is still owned by that person. Since we can all think that, we can also all respect that virtual connection, that intellectual property. And that is why Kant solves this antinomy by saying that both statements, the thesis and the antithesis, are both true. They are just true in a different way. They actually don't contradict each other, because both statements happen on a different level, so to say. And that, by the way, is how Kant always solves these antinomies, saying that both statements that seemingly contradict, he's not picking a side. He's not saying, okay, I have stronger arguments for the one side and against the other, but rather he's always saying they are both true or they are both untrue, and it's just a misunderstanding. Once again, it's dialectical to think that they contradict. Because Kant says the antithesis, you cannot own something while it is not in your physical possession, is true if by owning we are talking about physical ownership, we are talking about the possessio phenomenon. But the thesis, you can own something while it is not in your physical possession, is also true if by owning we mean something being your intellectual property, being your possessio noumenon. And this is indeed how we think, like, consider theft. If your bike is stolen from you, we would now say that you still own it and you don't own it anymore. At the same time, if we take the word owning to have two different meanings, right? We would say in the physical sense, you are no longer the owner of your bike if it is stolen from you. The thief is now the owner of the bike. Because it's no longer in your physical possession, it's in his possession. You can no longer do with it what you want. You can no longer drive around with it. He can. But at the same time, we would say that in the sense of whose intellectual property is it, you are still the owner of the bike, and the thief is not the owner of the bike. And that is what we denote by the word rightful, right? Saying you are the rightful owner of that bike, which is precisely why you have a right to get that bike back, which is precisely why if the thief was found, the police would confiscate the bike and give it back to you, because while you have no physical ownership of it right now, there's still this virtual relation between you and the bike that everyone can think of. Everyone can still think of you as the rightful owner. And this works, however, only if we abstract from the conditions of sensuality. Now, in my lecture on sensuality and on time and space as our forms of viewing, I explained that to Kant, all appearances appear in time and space. Those are our forms of viewing, meaning everything that I could possibly view, that I could possibly perceive and experience, I must view in space if it's outside of me, or at least in time if it's inside me, like my own feelings, my own thoughts. And something that is not spatial or temporal, like God as an object of pure reason, is just a thinking object. It is something that I can think, but it is something that I cannot possibly experience, that cannot possibly appear to me, because again, whatever appears must appear in time and space. Now, the possessio phenomenon, the physical, literal possession of an object, clearly happens in time and space. So, if we are completely empiricist, if we insist on time and space, there can only be that, and as soon as I let go of an object, I'm no longer its owner. The intellectual property is only possible if we abstract from time and space. If we say that, yes, in the world of appearances, it appears that I'm no longer the owner, because this object is no longer in my hand. I'm not holding on to it. But in the realm of purposes, or in the kingdom of purposes, and I also made a lecture about that already, which you might want to check out, the kingdom of purposes. Kant famously says that we are citizens of two worlds. I mean, actually, he does not say that word for word, even though many people think it's a direct quote of Kant. But in essence, he says that. He says, we inhabit this sensual world, this temporal, spatial world, just like non-rational beings, just like animals do. But at the same time, as rational beings, as free beings that have the autonomy to be able to set a purpose for themselves, that are not just driven by natural laws, by their desires, by their instincts, but that can decide themselves about their purposes. As such beings, we also inhabit an invisible kingdom of purposes, not just the kingdom of nature that is visible, but the kingdom of purposes that cannot be seen, cannot be experienced, but that we can think of. We can think of the purposes of human beings building an organic system, building a kingdom together, where the purposes should not contradict each other, should not get in conflict with one another, where we should try to create some sort of harmony of purposes and not interfere with others' purposes. Well, once again, if we abstract from time and space, and therefore if we abstract from the sensual realm, from our experience, we can say that in the invisible but thinkable realm of purposes, I can still be connected with an object, even though in the physical realm I'm not connected with it, but I'm separated from it by time and space. I can still be connected with that object because it can still be part of my purposes. It can still serve as maybe a means to reaching one of my ends, and therefore my purposes require these objects, and therefore they are still virtually, even if not physically, connected to me. In this sense, Kant says, the physical possession of an object is just the sensual schema of the actual intellectual property. So you can abstract from space, right? Once again, you can still own your house while you're not in it, or you can still own your phone while it's not in your hand or your pocket. So you can be separated from it by space. And you can also abstract from time. This for Kant is important mainly when we make contracts and agreements, right? Like if someone promises something to me, promises to do some work for me, let's say some work in my house or whatever, or promises to bring me some object that I ordered from him, then Kant would say, I now have a right in this precise moment where the promise is given and accepted. But of course, the next day or the next week or so, the person could refuse to give me what he promised. And when I complain about him breaking the promise, he could then say, no, in the very moment where I gave the promise and where you accepted it, I was not breaking it. In that moment, I was preparing to give you that thing. But now that moment has passed, and now you are separated from that moment by time. And so now you have no right anymore to what was promised. Again, if this would not work, right? If this was how things are, then we could never rely on others. We could never make contracts. We could never order things, and all of economy would not work if there couldn't be promises, there couldn't be contracts about certain actions that are undertaken in the future, or certain things that are delivered in the future. So here too, Kant says, we must be able to abstract from sensuality, and that means in this case from time, and to consider that we still own something, in this case this promise, whatever was promised to us, independently of the time that might be between the promise being given and the thing being delivered. And this whole position is an idealistic position, right? As is any position that relies not merely on experience, on what can be seen or touched or heard or whatever, but that relies on thinking. Any position that believes in something that is invisible, but can be thought by reason. And Kant calls this idealism in his philosophy of right or philosophy of justice the idealismus juridicus, so the juridical idealism. This juridical idealism is possible because the right doesn't deal with anything sensual at all. It doesn't deal with appearances, if you think about it. The right, as I said at the start, deals with our faculty of choice. It is all about the choices we make and the fact that we should only choose actions that don't interfere with others' free choice. The sensual, as such, does not factor in here. So, simply by making choices, you can already be connected with objects, not in a physical, but in a virtual sense. So this whole dialectic, this whole antinomy of right can be solved, according to Kant, precisely because we can be connected with an object not just physically, but through our purposes that we think. In layman terms, we could say we can be connected with something through the plans we make, through the will we have. So let's go back to the earlier example of the bike. If I take my bike somewhere and then I put it there and I go about my business, I'm not physically connected to the bike right now because I'm not riding it. But with my purposes, since I made the plan to take the bike later and go back home using that bike, through my purposes, I still have this virtual connection with the bike. And the right is concerned with precisely this virtual connection. So, once again, you have one of these parallelisms that I mentioned between the philosophy of right and the theoretical philosophy. Because one of Kant's main accomplishments is to show that thinking is connecting. That connections of all sorts, relationships of all sorts, are always something that we only think, that we don't perceive, right? I explained that in my lectures on theoretical philosophy, for example, my lecture, What is Experience? That Kant says what we perceive are only specific sensations in time and space, but not connections. Connections are thoughts. Indeed, that is all that thinking is. It is an connecting, a putting together, or as Kant puts it, a synthetic unity of the manifold. So synthesizing the manifold that my sensuality gives me into some sort of unity. And this, according to Kant, happens in 12 manners. I explained that when I talked about the table of judgments, that to Kant there are 12 forms in which we can judge, so 12 ways in which we can connect. And from that spring the 12 categories, the 12 basic concepts of our intellect, which I discussed in the lecture on the table of categories. One of which often serves best, if you want to have an example, is the category of causality. Kant, coming from Hume, who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, Kant realized that causality is not something that we perceive. It is something that we think. So the most famous example would of course be one billiard ball rolling against the second one and the second rolling away. This is what you see. You have two perceptions, the first ball and then the second ball moving. What you don't perceive is that the second ball moves because the first ball touched it, right? It could also be a coincidence that it just so happened to randomly start rolling away at the same second, right? So this is not something you perceive, this is something that you think. Causality is a thought, and only through this thought, through this connection that you make with your intellect between two different perceptions that you have, do these perceptions turn into experience, right? You now experienced something that the one billiard ball can push the other away. Or the other example that Kant gives, if you see the sun shining on a stone and now you touch the stone and feel that it's hot, you have these two perceptions of the sun shining onto the stone and of the stone being hot. But the connection between them, the stone being hot because of the sun shining on it, that is again something that you thought. That is again applying this category of causality to connect these two perceptions of yours. So all connections are thoughts. We don't see connections, we don't feel, we don't hear, we don't smell, we don't taste connections, we think them. And this, which is true in Kant's theoretical philosophy, which is true in the process of experience and cognition, this is also now what is important in his philosophy of right. Because the juridical connection with an object, that is, that object being yours, being your property, is also a connection, and as such is also something that mustn't be experienced, that mustn't be seen, but rather that must be thought, according to the very same 12 categories, by the way. And therefore, since this is basically how we all think of rights and of property, right? These are not special, lofty philosophical theories, but rather this juridical idealism is something that pretty much anyone without much reflection believes in. I mean, if you asked around on the street, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who believes that you only truly own an object while it is in your physical possession, and as soon as you put it away, anyone else is free to take it. Since everyone believes in this juridical idealism, this could be a good starting point to get into transcendental idealism in general. Because, again, this juridical idealism that pretty much everyone believes in only works if you consider time and space not to be things in themselves. Like if you don't consider objects to simply be, factually be temporal and spatial, and us just perceiving them as such, but rather if you agree with Kant that these are just the forms of our viewing. So we happen to view and to not be able to view things in any other way to view things in time and space, but the things in themselves are not in time and space. And because of the ideality of time and space, because of that we can abstract from them and we can think this other relation. We can think of something as being our property when it's physically disconnected from us. This should get people thinking. This would not work if the opposite of transcendental idealism, if transcendental realism was true. Of course, I'm very well aware that those who reject transcendental idealism, or more simply who don't yet understand transcendental idealism, will hardly consider this a convincing argument. But still, I do want to point out that this is, to Kant, one fact that points very strongly to the truth of his broader transcendental idealism, even beyond the philosophy of right. Because a statement that pretty much anyone would agree with in the realm of rights has, if you think about it, transcendental idealism as the condition of its possibility. Before closing off this lecture, there's one more thing that I want to address. And that is that Kant says that property obliges. Now, he doesn't say it in those exact words. I'm using those words mainly because they are well known in Germany nowadays, because nowadays that is what our constitution says. Property obliges. But Kant does basically say this. What he says is that if something is your property, then as such it is yours. You can do with it whatever you want. You can use it however you want. You can move it wherever you want. You can destroy it if you want. No one else can tell you off. No one else can tell you how to use your own property. That is basically what it means, that this is yours and not anyone else's, right? However, Kant says this only, your right to use your own property however you want, this only goes so far till you reach other people's rights. And the rights of other people, including the rights to their property, must not be harmed, right? You cannot use your property, and the right you have to use your property however you like, to attack other people's property and other people's right. So, for example, if you have a car, of course you can drive around in your car however you like, but if I have a garden and I have a bed of flowers, you cannot just drive onto my flowers and destroy my flowers. Now, this should be clear and self-evident and really doesn't need much explanation. However, what is important is that Kant says this also is true in more indirect cases, where maybe you don't use your property directly as a tool to destroy somebody else's, but still the way you use your property brings danger or harm to somebody else's property. He gives an example, and that is owning a house. If you own a house that is somewhere out in the open land, away from any other houses, then you can really do with your house whatever you want. And if you don't care for your house and over time it breaks down, it turns into a ruin, well, that's your problem, right? But it's your property, so that's your choice what to do with it. But in Königsberg, where Kant lived at his time, he explains, there were lots of houses that were built directly touching each other. They were built back to back, so to say, and they were built in such a manner that they would share the same beam to give the basic structure balance. Well, and in such a case, Kant says, if I own one of these two houses, and now the person who owns the other house is not taking care of his property, so his house starts falling apart, and the beam that gives balance and structure to both our houses starts rotting from his side, then this obviously also threatens my own property. And so here, when I tell the other person, take care of your house, because this affects my house too, it is not okay for the other person to just say, well, my house is mine, this is my property, you don't get to tell me what to do or how much to care for my property. But rather here, Kant says, I would have a right of compulsion, be it indirectly through the state, so I could complain and then the government could compel him. I do have a right of compulsion to force that other person to take care of his property in a certain manner. Now this for Kant is more of a side note, admittedly, and unfortunately it's usually not discussed when people talk about Kant's philosophy of right. But I think it is an important point that is worth contemplating because it has important consequences, especially for us nowadays. Because nowadays we live in a very much atomized and individualistic society. And when people think of the state, of course all thinking according to Kant happens within the 12 basic concepts of our intellect, the categories that he describes in his table of categories, which I talked about in its own lecture. And there are 3 categories of relation: substance and accident, causality, and lastly the category of community, or of the whole and the part. And nowadays, I would claim that most people are used to think of the state according to the second category of relation. So according to the category of causality. That is, they think of the state, and this includes the democratic state. It really makes no difference here what form of rulership there is in the state. And people tend to think of the state as something that is somehow detached from them. So here are they, the people, the individuals, living their lives, having their own property, and then there's this state on top of them, sort of imposed onto them, and this state is very annoying because it's constantly trying to interfere with their lives, constantly telling them what to do, like don't drive too fast with your car, that's not allowed, or constantly demanding things from them, like collecting taxes. And in many cases they would probably much rather be rid of the state. Well, I would say, coming also from Fichte, that we should rather think of the state in the third category of relation, so the category of community, or of the whole and the parts. We should understand ourselves not as individuals that happen to live under a state, but as parts of an organic whole, as parts of a commonwealth that we share with other people, and we have our property only as parts of this commonwealth, right? For all the people who say that taxes are theft and so on, if there was no state, like, you think you just have your property, you just have your money, and now it's taken away from you. But if there was no state, you wouldn't have these things in the first place. you have these things only thanks to society granting them to you and assuring you security in your property. If there was no state, if we were in the state of nature without any laws, anything could be stolen from you. And you would not have many things in the first place. Like there would be no infrastructure, there would be no roads and so on. And so no things could be delivered, the economy would not work in the same way. So you could not even buy many things. So really, we have our property not in spite of the state, and the state is not the enemy that constantly threatens to take away the property, but rather because the state grants the property. And so we have it only as part of a community, where my property depends on everyone else agreeing that this is mine, just like their property depends on me agreeing that this is theirs. And well, if that is the case, then it should indeed be, as in Germany the constitution says, that property obliges. And we should take such a statement seriously. Unfortunately, we don't. Like, it's one of those things that the constitution says that sound nice on paper, but that basically mean nothing. That basically have no relevance for actual life in this state, for the actual laws that there are. But it should have. And this is true especially nowadays in light of the ecological and the climate crisis. Because here, of course, the problem is precisely that people do with their property whatever they want and don't think that it obliges them. So there's lots of climate change deniers, and I refuse to see them as anything else. They can say theoretically that they believe in climate change, but if they don't act accordingly, then in the practical sense they do deny climate change. If you're sitting in a burning house, even if you say, yeah, the house burns, if you're not running around screaming, if you're not trying to put out the fire, in my book, you're a burning house denier. So these climate change deniers, they often say things like, oh yeah, the climate activists, if they don't like cars, they don't need to own a car, they don't need to drive in a car, they can drive a bike if they want, but they should let me drive my car is my property. And to that, coming here from Kant and his argument, I would answer, sure, your car as such may be your property, so you can do with it whatever you want. Like, you can park it on the street or you can park it in your garage. That is your choice. No one else can tell you which one to do. But the problem is that the moment you drive around with your car, through the noise it makes, through its emissions, is threatening my health and my right to my own health. And simply by me choosing to not drive in a car, I cannot avoid that still my health is harmed through your choice of driving your car. And on top of that, of course, your car is not just threatening my health, it is also destroying the climate through its emissions, and thereby it is threatening my property in many ways. Like, let's say I have a garden. Well, if there are continuously droughts, then nothing grows anymore in my garden. Everything will wither away and I will have to water things more. Or if because of the climate crisis there's great fires like we saw in LA some time ago, maybe my whole house burns down because you used your property, your car, in a specific manner. So I should have, therefore, to protect my own rights, my own health, my own property, the right to some degree, tell you what to do with your property. So that should mean that, sure, you can have your car and you can drive around in it to a degree. But if you go 100 meters to the store, not by foot, but in your car, simply because you're lazy, and you keep doing that, then that is an abuse of your property that harms all of society, and then society should have the right to take that property away from you if you keep doing that. Likewise, if you abuse your property, like to protest, like here in Germany a while ago, we had these big, not just in Germany, it was also in other parts of Europe, we had these big farmers' protests, which were very egoistical, very unpatriotic protests. If they achieved one thing, is they accidentally exposed the hypocrisy of the right, because some months before that in Germany we had this very prominent climate activist group, the Last Generation, who would glue themselves onto the streets, and there was so much hate against them because basically all of Germany, like 90% of Germans, are climate change deniers, and Germany is an especially close-minded and especially conservative and especially anti-patriotic country. So if anyone does anything patriotic, anything that is not selfish but that tries to actually save society and the state as such, they are hated. And the funny thing is, those climate activists, they were attacked with pseudo arguments saying, oh, they are blocking simple people that just want to drive to work with their cars, or they are blocking ambulances and threatening people's lives. They actually always left a free part on the street for ambulances. But then, some months later, you had these farmers' protests, and since this was not a protest against society's egoism, but only a protest against the government, and society already hates the government, everyone and the right-wingers, they of course love these farmers' protests, even though the farmers with their tractors blocked all the streets, blocked all the working people, blocked all the ambulances, and indeed did almost kill people, did actually threaten people's lives. So the hypocrisy of the right was very much exposed. But my point is, if you're a farmer, if you have a tractor, you should be obliged to use it for society. So sure, you can use it for your work, you can use it on your field, but you cannot use it on the street to block people and produce so much emissions, waste so much fuel to protest with your tractor. So this should be forbidden. And before anyone says, but protesting is an important right, they can protest like normal people, walking. I mean, no other profession does this. If the nurses are on strike, you don't see them rolling the hospital beds onto the street. And if the zookeepers are protesting, they don't come riding on top of the elephants and the lions. So if anyone else can protest on their feet, I'm sure the farmers can do it too. So this is, especially in the light of the economic and climate crisis, we need to find an answer to this also from the perspective of the philosophy of right. And I think here lies the answer in Kant saying, sure, property means it's yours, you can do with it whatever you want, but you still need to respect the rights of others and the property of others, and that limits your use of your property. You have an obligation to use your property only in a way that doesn't harm society and the property of other people. And this is something that we should start to take seriously and to enforce. That's what I wanted to talk about here. To summarize it, in private right, there are innate rights that are basically all about our freedom. And then there are acquired rights, rights to certain objects, rights to own certain objects, rights to property. And these acquired rights are necessary. It is necessary that property exists. Otherwise, even our innate rights to our freedom, to our life, would be threatened. And these acquired rights, of course, we can acquire a right temporarily when we literally hold on to an object, when it is in our possession physically. But that is not enough. So we must be juridical idealists. We must believe that there can also be some form of intellectual property, that we can still virtually be connected to a thing, be a thing's rightful owner, while in time and space we are not connected to that thing. Now, I want to further get into that topic in my next lecture, because for one, there remains the question, how exactly are we connected to things when we don't physically hold on to them? And I already alluded to it, that Kant works with his table of categories here, since these connections are connections that we think, and since all our thinking happens within these 12 basic concepts of our intellect, then Kant says there must also be 12 basic kinds of rights to property. And then second, there still remains the question, how does this start? How can something go from being temporarily mine because I hold on to it, because it's in my physical possession, to becoming my property that stays mine even when I put it away? So how does the original acquisition, as 18th century philosophy would call it, how does that work? Those are things that still remain to be discussed in my upcoming lecture.
My deep thanks be to my supporters:
Leo Allmann,
Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner,
Ron Suhl,
as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.